Welcome to the Principal Source audio presentation of Skepticism by David Kelley. Skepticism is the belief that knowledge of reality is impossible, and that man lacks any rational basis for certainty or confidence in what he thinks he knows. By undercutting the efficacy of reason, skepticism forces us to fall back on emotion, tradition, the authority of the church, mystical revelation, and non-rational philosophies in order to make our personal and political choices. For this reason, it is important to answer the attacks that skeptics have raised against the perceptual foundations of our knowledge. Concentrating on four of the classical skeptical arguments: illusions, dreams, the malevolent God or diabolical scientist, and the brain in a vat, Dr. Kelley identifies the pattern that all these arguments take and exposes their underlying motive, the desire to exempt consciousness from the law of identity. A well-known philosopher, teacher, and writer, David Kelley earned his Ph.D. in philosophy from Princeton University in 1975. He has since taught philosophy, cognitive sciences, and other courses at Vassar College and Brandeis University. Dr. Kelley's books include The Evidence of the Senses, The Art of Reasoning, and A Life of One's Own, Individual Rights and the Welfare State. He was recently featured on John Stossel's ABC TV news special, Greed, and is a popular lecturer and talk show guest. Dr. Kelley is founder and, since 1990, the executive director of the Institute for Objectivist Studies in Poughkeepsie, New York. This lecture was given in 1987 at York University. Dr. Kelley ably answered skepticism's traditional arguments by submitting them to objective validation and a process of proof, which in the end shows that despite the skeptic's claim to be cautious and rigorous in his approach to knowledge, he in fact is prepared to believe that anything is possible.
Thank you. I am an epistemologist. That is my field of knowledge. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that studies knowledge, that studies the nature and validation of knowledge. Now, in most disciplines, whatever their other internal disagreements, there is general agreement on the existence of their topic or subject matter. But over the centuries, epistemologists have spent an enormous amount of time and energy either asserting or trying to disprove the thesis that we don't have any knowledge, that knowledge is impossible. This is the thesis of skepticism. And that has been especially the case since modern philosophy began with the work of Rene Descartes in the early 1600s, when I would say, I think most philosophers would agree, epistemology came into its own as a distinct branch of knowledge, a distinct branch of philosophy. Of course, there were philosophers who discussed knowledge before that time. There were skeptics before that time. In ancient Greece, there was a sophist named Gorgias, who, according to legend, wrote a book maintaining three theses: A, that nothing exists; B, that if anything did exist, we couldn't know it; and C, that if we could know it, we could not communicate it in language. He was a skeptic. Skepticism also flourished for a time during the Hellenistic period, the few centuries just before the birth of Christ, and many of the skeptical arguments that are now part of the common repertoire of philosophers date from that time. But as a general and fundamental problem in philosophy, as something that absorbs epistemologists, skepticism is a modern phenomenon. Now, in general, skepticism means the belief that we lack knowledge or that we lack any rational basis for certainty or confidence in what we think we know. There are many forms of skepticism, therefore, depending on what type of knowledge is involved. For example, there is skepticism about the senses. How do I know that the world is the way that it appears? How do I know that the world, as I experience it, is not a complete illusion? How, for that matter, do I know there is a world out there? Or there's skepticism about induction and causal laws. How do I know that things will continue to behave in the way that I've observed them to behave in the past? How do I know the sun will rise tomorrow? Or there is skepticism about the existence of other minds. How do I know that what I take to be other people are not inanimate bodies mindless machines without any consciousness present. Now, of all of these, skepticism about the senses is basic. That's the fundamental one, because the senses provide us with our basic cognitive contact with reality. So all other knowledge that might be called into question depends on that sensory knowledge. If I can't even know that the sun rose yesterday, then the question doesn't arise whether it's going to rise tomorrow. If I can't even trust my perception of other bodies in the room, then it's premature to ask how I know that there are other minds animating those bodies. Okay, so my subject today is skepticism with regard to the senses. As Jeff mentioned, I've recently published a book called The Evidence of the Senses, in which I dealt somewhat briefly and in passing with skeptical arguments because I was defending a thesis called realism, which says that we do perceive the world and perceive it as it is, and the world is out there independent of us. But tonight I want to look at these arguments in a little more detail. I want to consider the classical arguments that skeptics have raised against the perceptual foundations of our knowledge. Now, these arguments are extremely abstract, theoretical, hypothetical. Some of them are going to sound, especially to those of you who may not be in philosophy or haven't taken philosophy courses, will sound like parlor games. In a sense, some of them are. No one is a skeptic in daily life. Skepticism as a doctrine is not the kind of global philosophy that people fight and die for. No one goes to the ramparts to defend skepticism. Even the great 18th century skeptic David Hume admitted that when he left his study, he went about his business the way everyone else did, on the assumption that the world out there exists and acts according to regular causal laws, even though he felt that he had proved that there's no rational basis for that assumption. But that's precisely why skepticism is important beyond the confines of epistemology. To believe that the senses cannot be trusted is to undercut any belief we might have in the efficacy of reason. So in the entire sphere of life outside epistemology, and there is life outside epistemology, outside even the academic kinds of questions that we're going to look at tonight, in the entire sphere of choosing values, making moral decisions at the individual level, and at the social level, engaging in politics, trying to structure a society that is suitable to man's nature. In all of these areas, skepticism leaves us with no reason to rely on reason. But we need some principles to use in making these choices. So we fall back on emotion, tradition, the authority of the church, mystical revelation, any number of non-rational bases for knowledge. We can't escape the need for some kind of philosophical outlook. Skepticism says we can't rely on reason, and therefore opens the door to non-rational philosophies. Okay. There's a personal incident that may encapsulate this connection I'm trying to draw. When I was a college student, I remember one night at dinner in the dining hall overhearing a conversation, eavesdropping on a conversation, between someone who was apparently a conservative of the religious type, someone who believed that politics should be founded on traditional religious views, and someone else who appeared to be a critic of that view. Anyway, the critic at one point took the issue right down to fundamentals and questioned the conservative's belief in God. And he said, how can you be so sure of it? Philosophers have poked holes in all the arguments for God's existence. And the conservative replied, why should I care whether that philosophers can't prove the existence of God? They can't even prove the existence of physical objects. They can't prove there's a table here. Right? So obviously their arguments are useless, and he felt justified in falling back on tradition or whatever it was that he relied on. And historically, we see the same connection on a much wider scale. Throughout the history of Western philosophy, the periods, such as the Hellenistic period, that were dominated by skeptical views tended to be followed by the rise of non-rational views, such as the religious cults that sprang up during that period in ancient Greece, of which, of course, the one that triumphed was Christianity. So the issues that I'm going to discuss today, no matter how abstruse they may seem, are in fact have a vital significance. They are not simply a philosophical parlor game. Okay, but with that context now, let's enter the game. I'm going to lay before you some of the skeptical arguments, and I'm going to do this quite quickly because there is a pattern. So first I want to go through the arguments, identify the pattern, then we'll come back and examine the arguments in a little more detail. And the place to begin here is with Rene Descartes, a work of his called The Meditations. Descartes himself was not a skeptic. He laid out a series of skeptical arguments for the purpose of trying to answer them. But his text is regarded as a kind of locus classicus for skeptical arguments because he presented them so concisely and powerfully. So it's a good place to, good text to work from. Okay, 4 arguments. First argument is an argument from illusions. Okay, we're all familiar with a typical introductory psychology type illusion. The bent stick in the water, if I put the chalk in the water, which I will not do, it would look bent, but in fact it would be straight because of the refraction of light. Descartes' example was a tower that in fact is round, cylindrical in shape, but from a distance, because your depth perception is too weak, it looks square. What you see is as if it were a solid flat plane. So you think it's square when in fact it's round. Now, Descartes concludes, quote, "What I have so far accepted as true par excellence, I have got either from my senses or by means of my senses. Now, I have sometimes caught my senses deceiving me, and a wise man never entirely trusts those who have once cheated him." Okay? So the argument here is, we know illusions are possible. How then do we know that all of our experience is not illusory? That's the first argument. Second argument turns on the phenomenon of dreaming. An illusion is a case in which we allegedly misperceive an object. The object appears to be something that other than what it is, but the object is still there. In a dream, there's a more radical gulf, it seems, between our experience in the world because the objects that we experience in dreams aren't there. We dream about objects that don't exist, that aren't there in the bedroom where we are asleep, and events that are not in fact occurring. It's all made up. So we have a full and vivid set of experiences in a dream of a world. So no matter how full and vivid our waking experience of what we call the real world might be, how do we know that that isn't all a dream? How can we prove that we are not all asleep right now? You can see that this is a more radical argument because it calls into question the very existence of the objects that we think we're perceiving. Some philosophers have referred to hallucinations in this regard, because an hallucination is an experience in which is a more radical disruption of your perceptual experience than an illusion. You seem to see and hear things that aren't there. But we'll stick with dreams. Okay, third argument. This is a little more sweeping. Suppose that there is a being who is like God, only is malicious instead of benevolent. This being is a demon, an evil spirit, exists for the sole purpose of fooling me. That's his only goal in life, is to deceive me. And he has made me believe that I have a body, that I exist in a world of other physical objects, but it's all make-believe. None of it's true. Descartes says, all of these things that I believe are mere delusive dreams by means of which he, the evil demon, lays snares for my credulity. In fact, Descartes' hypothesis about this demon is so sweeping that he felt he could not even trust his abstract capacity for reasoning. It might be that even though 2 plus 3 seems to him obviously to add up to 5, maybe the demon is fooling him about that. Maybe the demon has got a grip on his mathematical reasoning ability so that in fact 2 plus 3 equals something else. It just seems to him that it equals 5. Now you can see that this is a very sweeping hypothesis because it rules out not just the sensory level of knowledge and our confidence that we're perceiving a world, but any trust we might place in our cognitive faculties. But we'll use it tonight, we'll focus tonight just on its relationship to our sensory evidence. Okay, that's the third argument. The last one is really just a more contemporary vaguely scientific version of the same thing. Suppose, goes the argument, that I have been anesthetized completely. I've been subjected to an operation in which my entire brain is removed from my body. A complete neuroectomy. Not complete, because they leave the nerves in, but the brain. And they have preserved my brain, put it into a vat of preserving fluid that keeps its biological functions going. They have taken the nerves that lead into my brain, the sensory nerves, the optic nerve, auditory nerve, etc., hook them up to electrodes, which in turn are hooked to a computer, which has been programmed to stimulate those electrodes so that the signals coming into my brain give rise to exactly the kind of experience that I'm having. So that I have the experience of waking up every day, having my coffee, walking the dog, sitting down at the word processor to write an essay, for example, an essay saying how ridiculous skepticism is. But in fact, I'm not in a room, I don't have a dog, I am a brain in a vat. Sometimes this is embellished for the science fiction buffs by saying that instead of human scientists, these are aliens who have secretly transported me to a planet circling Arcturus. But science fiction is my thing, so we'll leave that embellishment out. All right, now, there's clearly a pattern here to these arguments. In fact, there's a single argument that is being presented in different forms. And I want to identify the pattern. When we perceive an object, we perceive it as something existing outside our minds. We perceive it as something existing independently of us in a physical world. The experience purports to be an experience of reality. If it isn't, then it's invalid. It's misleading. It's non-veridical. It's the term philosophers use for it. Non-veridical. Right? Well, the skeptical arguments are just different ways of saying that perhaps all our experience is non-veridical. Whenever we think we are perceiving something, say the objects in this room, the argument tells us that we could be having exactly the same experience even if these things were not there. Okay? The different cases, the dreams, the hallucinations of diabolical scientists, these are just different ways of trying to make graphic how such a non-veridical, a complete systematic but non-veridical experience could allegedly occur. Each one describes an experience, a type of experience that is said to be indistinguishable from an actual perception of a real world, but in fact is non-veridical. Okay? The argument then says, we can't prove that our experience is not of that non-veridical type, therefore we can't trust what our experience tells us about the presence of objects and the nature of the objects that we see. All right, let's look a little more closely at the presuppositions of the argument. Okay? It's clear that these alternative types of experience, the ones that are non-veridical, they must have two characteristics. First of all, they have to be indistinguishable from actual perceptions. If we could distinguish these non-veridical ones from actual veridical perceptions, then there wouldn't be a problem. We would just look and see and say, oh, now I'm having a non-veridical experience, so I won't trust it. Now I'm having a veridical one, so I will trust it. No, they have to be indistinguishable. Secondly, these non-veridical experiences have to be possible. They have to be a kind of experience that actually could occur. If they were impossible, then once again, we wouldn't have to bother trying to rule them out. There would be no reason why we should have to prove that they're not occurring. They can occur. Now, the key question in this regard is, who has the burden of proof? Does the skeptic have to prove it's possible that we are having such an experience? Or do we have to prove that we're not having that experience? Who has to make the first move here? Does the skeptic have to come along and actually establish that such experiences could occur? Or do we have to take it for granted that they could and prove that they're not happening? Now, I'm going to argue that the skeptic is the one who has the burden of proof and that he cannot discharge it. Any attempt to show that such experiences are possible, in fact, presupposes the existence of physical objects and some reliability of sense perception. So that's my basic strategy. Okay, let's start by examining the context in which any such argument must be presented. The context is our actual experience. The skeptic says that we have to start from what's given to us in our direct experience. We can't rely on any other knowledge that we have. For example, we can't rely on evolution and say that our senses were selected for their ability to represent the world accurately, because the skeptic will say, how do you know about evolution? The basis evidence for evolution all traces back to sensory evidence at some point. So we have to start just with what's given to us in direct perception. We have to start with what is self-evident there. All right, that's fair enough. I think we should start there too. Let's examine what is given and self-evident to us in our perceptual experience of the world. And we'll consider it in and of itself, as the skeptic requests. We will try to put ourselves in the position of children looking at the world without any sophisticated knowledge about how the world works, how their senses work, or any of that. We'll just examine our experience from the inside as conscious subjects who are capable of having these experiences. The skeptic's conclusion is that our experience, say, of an object like the podium, might be invalid. There might be no podium here. Now, if he just asserted this without any argument, his assertion would have to be dismissed out of hand. We would have to say that's impossible. It's not possible that the podium isn't there. Why? Why do I say that? Well, think about it. Examine your perception. You're aware. It's a form of awareness. And to be aware, you must be aware of something. What is that something? Well, as far as you can tell, it's this object here. When you reflect on your experience of these objects, when you reflect on your experience of anything, you are aware of it as an experience of certain objects. Take away the objects, and there's nothing left. It all goes dark. And you would no longer be aware. To be aware is to be aware of something. And there's something more we can observe. We experience our perceptual awareness as metaphysically passive. That is, we don't experience it as creating the objects, but as revealing them. Okay? The podium, the walls, the people in the room, all of these exist in a world that you are in, not a world that is in any way in you. Your attention to a given object, as you turn your head to it and then turn away, your attention may come and go, but you don't experience the onset of your attention to an object as the object springing into existence. As you turn to look at an object, you experience that object as something there which comes increasingly into your visual field, something that was there for you to explore, and then you chose to explore it and see what it was. Moreover, the things that you perceive have certain characteristics. The podium has a shape, a color, size. It has relationships to other things, spatial relationships to the other objects on the table. It engages in certain actions. It's not very active right now, but there are certain things it can do and certain things it won't do. You observe that as well. These constitute its identity. And its identity is something that your experience reveals to you. It's not, the identity of this object doesn't depend on you. The thing is what it is. It's not what you make of it. Now, we can summarize all of this in terms of what I call, this is Ayn Rand's term actually, the primacy of existence. Primacy of existence says perceptual awareness is inherently a relationship between you and a world of objects. That to be aware is to be aware of something. It's a relationship between, awareness is a relationship between subject, you, the subject of consciousness, and an object, between consciousness and existence. And existence is the primary term in that relationship. Consciousness doesn't create what it is conscious of, it reveals it. Now, I'm not dismissing skepticism yet. I'm simply trying to describe the way things seem to me as I examine my own experience from the inside, and I assume that you would find the same things if you examine your experience from the inside. Now, maybe this perspective that we're adopting here is wrong in some way. We'll leave it open for the skeptic to try to prove that it is. But if he's asking us to start from what is self-evident, we have to examine what is given. And I would say that this observation is in fact given. Now, so let's consider how a skeptic might proceed. Suppose that a skeptic came along and said, maybe you're not conscious. Maybe you're not aware. Well, you know that's wrong. It's obviously wrong. Of course you're aware. You can observe your own awareness. It's self-evident. In fact, you'd have to be aware, you have to be conscious even to understand this supposition. If the skeptic did manage to create any doubt in your mind as to whether you are conscious, the very doubt would itself be a conscious state. So you can see that there's no way for the skeptic to call into question the fact that you are conscious. This is something Descartes himself identified. It's the principle of the cogito, the famous argument, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. This is the one thing he felt the demon couldn't fool him about, that he was conscious. Okay, now, that's something that most skeptics would agree with. They say, we can't be skeptics about the existence of our own consciousness. Fair enough. Well, now let's suppose a skeptic comes along and says that perhaps the things that you see, the objects of your awareness, perhaps they have no independent existence. They exist only in your own consciousness. Well, this supposition is also unintelligible, and it's unintelligible in the same way as the supposition that we're not conscious. Why? Well, we can isolate our own awareness when we examine perceptual experience. We can isolate the element of awareness only by contrasting it with the objects that we're aware of. We look at this experience, we say, well, oh, I see, there's an object, and I'm aware of it. My awareness is that which isn't the object, but a certain relationship between me and the object. So, someone who suggests that the objects are in our consciousness is undercutting the very contrast between object and awareness that was necessary in order for us to form the concept of our own awareness. The skeptic is, so to speak, stealing the concept of consciousness from the context in which it is possible to form that concept. It's as if someone tried to explain the meaning of the term female by contrasting female and male, and then said, oh, but you know, it could be that all males are female. Well, no, it couldn't be. Or if it is, then I don't understand what female means anymore, because you told me what it means only by contrasting it with male. So you see, you can't use a concept to undercut the cognitive bases of that concept, that drains it of meaning. And that's what the skeptic is doing, so far as we can tell from this perspective, this that we've adopted on our own experience. So the skeptic cannot simply assert that the objects we perceive may not exist apart from us. That he has to offer some argument. He has to give us some reason to think that the perspective we've just adopted of examining our experience from the inside is not the whole story. It's naive in some way. It doesn't reveal all there is to be known about consciousness, awareness, or the way it works. He has to find some way to drive a wedge between the objects that we think we can see perfectly well and ourselves as conscious subjects. Now, it is possible to do this to some extent and in a certain respect. This perspective of examining our own experience from the inside does not tell the whole story about consciousness. That's true. And this is where the skeptical arguments come in. So let's turn now to those arguments and see whether they can drive a large enough wedge between the objects that we're aware of and ourselves to make us doubt the validity of our senses. First of all, the skeptic says that illusions occur. And so let's ask what an illusion is. Actually, that is a rather long story, in my view anyway. But the key point here is illusions are possible, the bent stick in water and the others. They are possible because the properties that I'm aware of in objects, such as their shape or color, in some cases, these properties are things that I attribute to the object as intrinsic properties. Okay? When you look at the podium, everything you see, the color, the shape, the size, you attribute those properties to this as intrinsic properties of the podium itself. Okay? Everything is out there as you experience it. But in fact, not everything is out there in that sense, because we know that some properties depend in some way on our own perceptual faculties, right? Or on the causal chain that lies between the object and ourselves. That's the case with a bent stick. The reason the stick looks bent even though it's straight is that light is refracted by the passage from water to air. Okay, but the question now is, how am I going to come to know that? How am I going to come to know that illusions are possible? How, for that matter, does the skeptic know they're possible? Well, let's look at an example. Let's take a case of an illusion that might fool anyone. You walk into a room, you look at the curtains, they're rose-colored, but in fact, the curtains the curtains are beige. They're just being illuminated by the setting sun, so they only look rose-colored. Well, this is a case in which if you didn't know what was going on, you might well make a mistake. You'd say, these are rose-colored curtains. The rose color is really there in the curtain. That's not the case. But how can I come to know that it's the case, not the case? And how can the skeptic come to know that? Well, obviously the skeptic knows that the curtains are not in fact rose-colored, because the skeptic knows that they are beige. He's been in the room before and he saw that they were beige. Also, he knows that the setting of the sun cannot possibly change the actual color of the curtain. All right? Maybe over years and years it will, but not at a moment. The sunlight just isn't that strong. Now, all of this is knowledge about the world. All of this is knowledge about physical objects, the nature of light. It involves actually a lot of causal knowledge. Where did the skeptic get that? Obviously through his senses. How is he going to convince me of it? By getting me to trust my senses at least far enough to see what the curtains look like when normal light is falling on them. So, however you put it, the skeptic knows that illusions are possible because they actually occur, and he knows that illusions actually occur only because he knows that some of the apparent properties of objects are incompatible with their real properties. Okay? The apparent rose color is not compatible with what he knows to be the real color of the curtains. But of course, that's knowledge of reality. He's relying on his knowledge of the way objects really are in order to discover that illusions are possible. So you cannot then turn around and use the existence of illusions to call into question any capacity to know what real objects are like. Now, in general, let me try to formulate the general philosophical point here. It's true that not all of the attributes that we experience objects as having are intrinsic features of those objects. Some of them are relational properties. They result from the interaction between the object and our sense organs in the medium of perception. That's because the senses work in a certain definite way. They're not exempt from the law of causality. They operate according to their own nature by responding to light or sound waves or chemicals in the air, whatever it might be, and responding in certain definite ways. And that is bound to affect the way objects look. Okay? But we discover that, and that is a fact that's not available to us. It's not visible to us if we look at our experience only from the inside. From the inside, I don't know that I have visual receptors or a visual nerve leading to the brain or, for that matter, a brain. I don't see any of that. What I see is the object. It's only by pursuing a certain course of scientific inquiry that we learn that these things are possible. But that is inquiry about the world that we're perceiving. And therefore, any doubt about the validity of our initial perceptions would call into question the knowledge that illusions are possible or that objects may not always be what they seem. So the skeptic is trying to undercut the very knowledge that he depends on in mounting his argument. So in fact, he's not calling the primacy of existence into question, he's reaffirming it. All right, now let's turn to dreaming. What I've laid out for you is a general pattern of an answer, and I'm just going to be applying the same pattern in all the different cases. But each one raises slightly different questions. Let's look at dreaming. Now, once again, dreams are a real phenomenon. But once again, when the skeptic appeals to this phenomenon, he's reaffirming the primacy of existence. Okay, the obvious point about the argument from dreams is that dreams are supposed to be indistinguishable from waking experience. And the obvious problem is that each of us does in fact distinguish dreaming from waking. We do it roughly once a day, usually in the morning. Some of us do it more often. And we do this throughout the whole course of our lives. No matter how vivid a dream may be, when we wake up, that dream pales beside the kind of contact with reality that we have when we're awake. By the light of day, a dream takes on what we call a dreamlike quality. They're often incoherent and contradictory. And even if they're internally consistent, they don't fit into the pattern of our waking experience. We dream we are in Tahiti, and we wake up somewhere else, and we could not have gotten from Tahiti there in the time it took us to wake up. Okay, now, skeptics usually reply that in a dream we may have the experience of thinking that we're awake. Okay? Many people have had such dreams. You are in a dream and you wonder whether you're dreaming or awake, and you decide that you're awake. Okay? Now, philosophers have a specialized version of this, very common among philosophers. They usually have it in graduate school. I had this dream myself when I was studying these issues. You dream that you're in a philosophy seminar arguing with a professor who is presenting the skeptical arguments, and you say, no, I can't be dreaming. I know I'm not dreaming because my dream wouldn't be this clear and vivid and consistent. It wouldn't fit into the whole pattern of my life the way this does. And then you wake up and feel like a jerk. But of course, you feel that way only because you then know that you were only dreaming. But in any case, this particular, the fact that we cannot distinguish dreams from waking when we're asleep doesn't prove anything about what we can do when we're awake. The fact that our judgment is sufficiently deranged while we are sleeping that we cannot make this distinction doesn't prove that we are deranged when we are awake. But in any case, the skeptic himself presupposes that we can distinguish dreaming from waking. Why? Because he assumes that dreams are non-veridical, that the events don't really occur, the objects don't really exist. That's implicit in the very concept of a dream. Okay? So how does the skeptic know this? How does he know that the events that he dreamed of didn't really occur? Well, because he formed the concept in the same way we did. He wakes up every day, knows that what he was just experiencing was only a dream and therefore wasn't real. Okay? If we really could not distinguish dreams from waking experiences, then we would have to assume that all our dream experiences were true, were veridical. I dreamed I was chased by tigers last night. Now, if I couldn't distinguish dreaming from waking, I would have to assume that I was chased by tigers last night. Okay? All my experience would be all of the same type. And I would say it must all be true. It's only because I know that there's a difference between dreaming and waking that I can say the dream experiences aren't real. And it's only because I can say they aren't real that I can raise any question about veridicality. So the skeptic is, in using dreams in his argument to try to undercut waking experience, is in fact assuming that he can make that distinction. So once again, he's presupposing knowledge of reality in the attempt to argue that we can't trust any knowledge of reality that we get through our senses. Okay, let's turn now to the evil demon, which raises a slightly different question. Raises a slightly different question because here there's no need or possibility of arguing that an experience given to us by this demon would have to be distinguishable from a real perception. That's the argument we made in dreams, but we can't make it here. Why? Well, the demon is Descartes' invention. This is Descartes' story he's telling. Okay? He's attributing to this demon godlike powers, omniscience, omnipotence, at least sufficient power to do whatever he wants with our minds. Okay? This demon can control our reasoning, so we get mixed up about simple arithmetic. So why couldn't it give us an experience that is just like an ordinary perception, a systematic delusion? This is Descartes' own personal fantasy. He can fantasize whatever he wants. And he can attribute to the demon whatever power he wants. But the question is, how can Descartes show us that such a thing is possible? That such a demon could exist and could give rise to the kind of experience that he is talking about. And obviously, he's not going to establish that this is possible by giving us an actual example, as in the case of illusions and dreams. One of the significant things about demons is that there aren't any. So there are no examples to be given. So is Descartes' capacity to imagine the demon a proof that it's possible? No. To say that something is possible is to make a statement about reality. And nothing follows about the nature of the world from the fact that Descartes is capable of having these arbitrary subjective fantasies, except that Descartes himself is capable of having these arbitrary subjective fantasies. Okay? For example, it's perfectly possible to imagine a contradiction. I see no reason why one can't imagine the internal angles of a triangle equaling something other than two right angles, even though we all learned in high school, we learned a proof that that would entail a contradiction. And therefore, the internal angles of a triangle must equal two right angles. But I can imagine them equaling 179 degrees, 181 degrees. Why not? Descartes would argue that the hypothesis of the evil demon is logically possible, that there's no contradiction involved. But remember that the context in which he is trying to persuade us of this is the naive perspective that we've adopted, in which we're considering only what is given and self-evident from the standpoint of our looking at our experience from the inside. Okay? In that context, it's a straightforward contradiction to say that the objects we're aware of might not actually be there. That's a contradiction. If they weren't there, then there would be nothing for us to be aware of. If the idea is that they might just be images in our consciousness, then again, from this perspective, there's no way we can make sense of that. That's unintelligible to say that they're in consciousness for the reason I outlined before. We form the concept of consciousness only by contrast with objects outside it. So either way, there's no basis for believing that this demon and his power of deceiving us in this way is even logically possible. There's no way we can make sense of it. Okay, let's turn to the final argument now, the brain in the bat. This combines elements of both of the preceding types of cases that I talked about. Unlike Descartes' demon, this hypothesis has a sort of a vaguely scientific air. It bears some relation to what we know about the way the senses work, and in that respect we have to treat it along the lines of illusions and dreams. But on the other hand, there's a sense in which when push comes to shove in the argument, it turns out that these diabolical scientists are being attributed, in effect, omnipotent powers, which makes them very much like Descartes' demon, but in slightly more modern dress. All right. At a fundamental level, I think the answer that I would give to this argument is clear. The story is about my senses, stimulation of my sense organ, of my sensory receptors, and the fibers leading to the brain by electrodes, which are wired up to computers. Somehow I have to be told, I have to be given the knowledge to make this intelligible to me, to make this, use this to call into any doubt what I derive from my experience. You have to explain to me that there are electrodes, that there are computers, that I have sense organs, that there's an optic fiber leading to my brain. This is knowledge of reality. Clearly, the supposition presupposes a whole raft and background of knowledge about the world. So we can't then use that knowledge, any more than the other cases we've talked about, to call into question the basis on which we know it, namely our sense perception. And if we couldn't trust our senses, then we could not have acquired the knowledge that there are electrodes, that the senses work in this way. Okay? So in general, the argument presupposes that a physical world exists and that it operates in certain specific ways. So we can't then turn around and use that knowledge to cut off its own foundation. But let's play along with the argument a little further. Let's suppose that we're not the victims of the argument, of the experiment. We know that we're perceiving, but some other poor victim has been chosen and his brain excised and he's been hooked up. Okay? Is it possible in that case? And how would he know? Would he be able to know that whether he is a brain in a vat or a live, normal, functioning human being? Well, I don't think it's clear, actually, whether that is possible. It's not clear whether the brain would continue functioning under those circumstances, or whether the computer programs the electrodes could provide a sufficiently rich array of stimulus information to completely duplicate ordinary perceptual experience. I'm skeptical about that, but suppose it is possible. At the very least, we know that the illusion would have to be total. And that would mean that not only the incoming nerve fibers would have to be programmed, but the outgoing motor nerves that control or used to control the guy's eyes and arms would have to be hooked up to the computer as well, because our perceptual experience takes account of our own motion. As we turn our eyes, we integrate the information that our eyes are turning with the change in the scene that we're seeing. And that's how we know that we're perceiving a stable world even though our eyes are moving. So we would have to wire up this brain so that it not only could perceive, but could act. It could initiate action. So now we have a subject who is getting reliable information about something outside him, namely the computer, and he is capable of acting on that, and his own actions will affect the nature of the stimulation he's getting. I would say in that case, he is perceiving a physical world, the computer, the world of the computer. Depend a little bit on how this story was told, but he's perceiving something. Okay? And he could eventually discover that the something he's perceiving is different from the something that we perceive, right? By normal scientific inquiry. He would take him some time, but eventually he should be able to discover the underlying nature of what it is that he perceives. It's just that the outcome in his case of this kind of inquiry is different from the outcome in our case. We discover that what we perceive, its underlying nature, is atoms with properties that allow them to bind into macroscopic objects and reflect light of a certain wavelength. He would discover that the underlying nature of what he perceives is certain electronic states of the computer. But there's no reason why he could not discover that. After all, the computer is supposed to be something different from what we're perceiving. So eventually that difference would have to lead to some observable consequence. Unless, and this is what the argument really presupposes, the scientists have the power, no matter what the subject does, no matter what test he proposes or experiment he performs, to suspend or to step in between the underlying nature of the computer and the consequence that the subject might observe and fool him, throw him a curve. But you have to assume that they could do that for any causal connection whatever, which means they would have, in effect, to be omnipotent. They would have to be able to anticipate every conceivable thought that the subject might have, but that, in effect, means they have to be omniscient. At least have a form of cognition that goes so far beyond the human that we have to call its very possibility into question, in the same way that we question the possibility of a demon. Okay. So this is the respect in which, really, we're not talking about scientists or a clearly possible situation. We're talking about someone's imagining, in effect, a godlike being. So my final, the conclusion I draw about this is that the problem with the skeptic is really that he's too credulous. Okay. He claims to be extremely cautious and rigorous in his approach to knowledge, but in fact he's prepared to believe that anything is possible. He's prepared to believe this to an extent that would put to shame the readers of a supermarket tabloid, the kind with headlines like medical breakthrough, new hope for the dead. That's child's play compared to evil demons and these diabolical scientists. Okay? So in that respect, there is a certain similarity between the mystic and the skeptic. And you remember at the beginning of the lecture I said historically there's a connection between those two approaches to knowledge. Given what we've just seen, I think that connection shouldn't be surprising. Okay? Thank you. Okay, let's get started. Before I begin with the answers I'd like to give to the written questions and then open the floor to your spontaneous questions, let me pass along a request in regard to the taping. If you could speak clearly and distinctly, to use Descartes' phrase, so that the tape can pick it up, and try to make the question as concise as possible. I don't want to discourage discussion, but make it as concise as possible so that if I need to repeat it, I can hold it in my own consciousness. Okay, let me start with a couple of written questions that I got. One asks, could I define knowledge? I didn't define knowledge during the talk, and yet I was talking about its possibility. This actually is a somewhat difficult question because it really depends on the context in which we are functioning and the need we have for the concept. In a broad sense, knowledge just is another name for awareness or cognition, any grasp of reality. And that, I would say, that concept is not definable because it's a primary. It is an axiomatic concept. It's because awareness of reality is sui generis. All we can do is point to it, grasp it by direct observation from the inside, because we are conscious. And we can give synonyms. We can say to be aware, to be conscious, to grasp a fact, to cognize a fact, but all of these mean the same thing. In this sense, the concept of consciousness is like the concept of existence. There's no way you could define existence. All you can do is give synonyms. Are we okay? However, there is a need for a narrower concept of conceptual level cognition, conceptual level grasp of reality. This is what most philosophers in epistemology today mean by the term knowledge. So they define it in terms of the conceptual knowledge that would be formulated in propositions as a complete sentence. And in that case, then I would say knowledge is the conceptual grasp of reality. And because of the way concepts are formed, that implies that it is based on sensory perception, but represents a higher level of integration that involves abstracting common properties from similarities and differences. So we form concepts like table, chair, horse, etc., and formulating them according to and establishing their truth according to the rules of logic. Okay, let me turn to another question. All right, yes. I mentioned the example of the sun rising tomorrow. Why is the skeptic not right? How do I know the sun will rise tomorrow? Well, let me reformulate the question. The sun, at least I subscribe to the heliocentric astronomy, so the question is, how do I know that the Earth will keep turning so that the sun, as we say, comes up? How do I know the Earth will keep turning? Because, well, I'm not a scientist, and I think I'm in a room full of many scientists, so I hesitate to lay out the physics of it, but it has to do with the mass of the Earth and the fact that it is something about conservation of angular momentum. It couldn't just stop without a cause. Right? Now, how do we know that? Well, we know it because of fundamental laws about the behavior of massive objects. No? How do we know that these laws are true? Well, because we have identified, it's part of the identity of an object to act in a certain way. That is part of its identity. And its identity is its identity. It won't change without some cause. Things act the way they do because they are the way they are. This is an Aristotelian view of causality, and it's what it means is that the law of causality is an implication or part of the law of identity. It says a thing has a certain identity. So that's all I can say. I discovered that the identity of rotating objects is that they continue in rotation until they're stopped. We have abundant inductive evidence for that. Now, there are very specific technical questions about the justification of induction that arise, but the basic idea of a thing suddenly beginning to act in some way other than the way its nature the way we have observed it acting in the past, without any change in its nature, means that actions are detached from the identity of an object. That actions are free-floating, random, inexplicable phenomena. And that gives a metaphysical primacy to action that it doesn't have. An action is an action of an entity. So the type of action an entity performs must be consistent with its identity. Okay, that is the, as I said, that's the fundamental question. And I'm sorry if I got the physics wrong, but the basic idea is right. Okay, now here's a question about the evil demon example. I think it's about the evil demon. A comparison between a benevolent and a malicious God. One can argue that a benevolent God threw the dice and created world number one. In this creation, our perceptions and illusions are self-consistent and preordained. Okay? And the inhabitants, I'm not sure what this means, the inhabitants have no way of exploring outside the limits that this God has ordained. The God could equally well throw the dice and create world number two. That has a separate set of rules and perception of reality. This is a many worlds point of view. Okay, well, I think that's the essence of the question. There are many worlds that are possible. How do we know which one we're in? Okay. Well, I don't think there are many worlds. There's reality. That's what you mean by the world. I don't think that you can start with the idea of possibility and project a whole range of worlds, realities that are all possible, and then say, well, we live in one that's actual, but maybe one of the others could be the case, and we can't prove that it isn't. The concept of possibility has to be derived somehow. That concepts don't spring into existence as cognitive goods. They have to be produced. The only way to produce them is by integrating sensory material. So I would say the only way to form the concept of possibility is to start where we started tonight, looking at the world, the objects you see, noticing that they can act in certain ways and not in other ways, forming the concept of possibility and using it accordingly. But you cannot reverse the process and start by saying this, that, or the other is possible just because it can enter your mind, just because you can conceive of it. So I'm not sure I have answered what the questioner was getting at, but I think the idea, insofar as the question turns on the idea of possible worlds, and a whole raft of possible worlds that God could have created, I don't accept the concept of possible worlds in that sense. Also, I don't believe in God. And this is relevant here because, again, to show me that it's possible for God to have done something, the first thing would have to be to show me that there's a God. And again, I start where we started tonight, with what's self-evident to me. And if anyone can offer such an argument, I'll be happy to entertain it. But I've never heard an argument that starts from actual observable facts and shows that a God is even the possibility that a God exists. A pure consciousness detached from any physical being, which has omnipotent powers and omniscient means of knowledge. So, okay. Now let's take any questions from the floor. Anyone have something? Yes.
Occasionally, I've gotten into discussions with people who are skeptics, and no matter what I say or how eloquent my argument, they still say, you might be wrong, or I don't believe you, or whatever. And it seems that some people just cannot accept any notion of certainty. They refuse to accept any notion of certainty. Other than walking away exasperated after a few minutes, or a period of time, have you found a useful technique for convincing people like this that certainty indeed is possible?
Have I found one?
Yes.
No.
Okay. So after a appropriate period of time, walking away is the only appropriate action.
Yeah, it's the... at some point it is. At some point it is, because if you have explained why the fact that it's possible for you to make a mistake doesn't mean that you're actually making a mistake in this case, unless you can be given some evidence for it. Well, if you've gone through that and explained it, then the argument just goes in circles and there's no further point to take it. Or in the case if it's skepticism about the senses, if you go through the arguments and the person keeps saying, well, but it's possible there's this demon, or possible that he's scientist, or whatever, and you ask how you know it's possible, and the person still says, well, but it is, then the argument has to stop. Now, I think that because Ayn Rand had an analysis of skepticism and what the motivation behind it was, and since I'm confident that it's false, I will entertain hypotheses about what motivation there is other than, you know, reasonable misunderstanding. But I think that it's useful. I mean, it's a true analysis and fundamental. It's that the skeptic shares the same ideal of knowledge that the mystic has, namely effortless, automatic, infallible knowledge that entails no risk or requires no effort. The skeptic says there isn't any such knowledge, so there isn't knowledge at all. And the mystic says, oh yes, there is knowledge like that. I have it because God spoke to me, or whatever. And if that is the motive at work, there's no argument you will give to persuade someone who simply doesn't want to accept the idea of knowledge that requires an active process that takes effort and entails the possibility of error. You're just stuck. Yes?
When does the line get crossed between dreams spoken of skeptically and dreams spoken of mystically, as far as senses and perception are concerned?
Could you tell me what you mean by dreams spoken of mystically?
Dreams skeptically, one speaks of having dreams, and thereby how can we know that we really are awake or not? Mm-hmm. Then dreams almost become perception to mystics.
I see. The question is, how do we distinguish for the tape? How do we distinguish dreams, the skeptic's interpretation of dreams, from the mystics? And that's an interesting point. The mystic is someone who believes that his dreams are true, right? That he actually was visited by an angel last night. Say, to mention one particular dream of some significance in Western culture. I wouldn't say there's a line between the two types of dreams, because I think there's only one type. The skeptic is right about dreams. The objects don't occur. But as I say, because of the connection between mysticism and skepticism in the concept of knowledge, it's not surprising. A dream, in effect, is the ideal. If only it could be true. Right? It's effortless cognition. Yes?
Okay, in mathematics, there's a need to go, it seems, beyond the immediate sense perceptions in forming concepts and basic things in geometry like point, line, just terms like that I can't see how they could be formed from pure sense experience. How would you form sort of concepts of infinity and all these useful things in mathematics that don't have the same immediacy as like the chairs and tables?
Okay. Well, I think they all can be formed by a process of abstraction from sense perception. There are a lot of technical questions about how it's done in the philosophy of mathematics, but in essence, I would say you form the concept of a solid object by identifying the three dimensions of physical space, and then you can abstract a two-dimensional object from that. Okay? The thing has a surface. You can form a concept of a surface because there are such things, and then you simply disregard certain aspects of the surface, like that it has a depth, and consider it only insofar as it has these two dimensions. And then you can consider a line, and even though the line has some breadth and depth, you disregard those, and you focus only on the length on that dimension. But you do that with the understanding that you're not going to pay attention to it, but it does exist. Okay, any actual line would have some breadth and depth. And finally, with the point, it's the intersection of the lines considered as having no breadth, depth, or length at all, but simply as a location. But you realize that any actual location would have some size and therefore some measurement in all three dimensions. Infinity, I would say, we form the concept by the fact that there are certain processes that we perform, which, like adding, 1, 2, or counting rather, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which we can, in any actual case, we count only up to a certain number, but we can see that there is no particular need to stop at that number. We always could go further. And so we abstract, we just disregard the fact that we always have to stop at some point, and focus only on the fact that there is the absence of any necessity for stopping at a particular point. Now, I mean, this is very rough, but that's how I think you can form the concept of concepts that are used in mathematics without, on the basis of sense perception. Even though there are no such things as actual points or infinities. Okay? Yes?
You mentioned in your talk about how identity is related to causality. When I read about causality, I often get it usually described in different terms. One is simply put that an action can't happen before its cause, or you can't go back in future. And another one is that if you set up some system, then you establish its initial conditions, then it'll go through the same identical process over and over again as long as you set up the same conditions.
Mm-hmm.
How do you relate these two common expressions of causality to the one that you say?
Well, the basic idea of causality that I have, as I said, is an Aristotelian one, in which which forms the concept of causality by observing that entities act. Now, entities act in certain conditions, and the way that they act, the particular action that an entity will take, depends partly on its own nature and partly on the conditions in which are impinging on it. But the way the primary term here is the entity's own nature, because the way it will respond to those conditions depends on its nature. You know, if I have a thing here and I run the billiard ball to collide with it, right? The collision is the initial condition, but what happens will depend on the nature of the object here. If it's another billiard ball, it'll roll off. If it's a glob of shaving cream, it will disperse. If it's an egg, it will break and all over the table. So the understanding of the concept of causality that you gave was the relationship between the conditions in which an entity acts and the action it performs as a result. And that's certainly a real relationship, but it is mediated by the relationship exists because of the nature of the entity which is acting. So to give a full account of causality, you have to include both elements. Does that answer your question?
What about the time? You can't go backwards in time, but an event can't happen before its cause. That's often taken as the statement of causality and not the fundamental one you gave.
Well, I would say that the fact that an effect cannot occur before its cause is an implication of the very concept of the way we form the concept of causality. We observe that actions happen, and actions are not autonomous, free-floating existence. They are actions of entities. So they can be explained. But by the very nature of time, maybe this is a self-evident truth, by the very nature of time, that which explains an action must be something occurring simultaneously with it or prior, certainly not after it. But I'd still say that's a derivative, that's an implication or a corollary of the basic idea of causality. Okay, yes?
I'll follow a very simple question on this. In our fellow in the brain in the vat is allowed to be able to perceive objects, and you'll be able to perceive this with a pen.
The question is, couldn't the scientist in this example distort his perception sufficiently to prevent it from doing that? Well, certainly they could program the computer, assuming this is even possible in the first place, to preserve the brain that way. They could stimulate those electrodes in such a way that his experience is totally chaotic, in which case he could not even form perception of solid, enduring physical objects. But in that case, then, that would clearly be a distinguishable form of experience from the one we have. Remember, the examples, all these arguments depend on the assumption that the experience that the victim gets is indistinguishable from the one that we have, and therefore it must have the feature that we can act on our world and observe consequences. Okay? We can observe, we pass our hand in front of something and find it occluded visually. We move around and notice perspective changing. Now, if the scientists don't want to do that, then they're not reproducing the experience, and so they have no, the case is not described in such a way that it provides an argument for the skeptic. So I was assuming that they would somehow stimulate these electrodes in such a way as not to distort the perception in that way. Now, okay, I think that's the answer. Other questions? Yes.
During the historical overview you gave in your talk, you talked about how the skepticism in the Hellenistic period was followed by periods of irrationalism in the Dark Ages. Then you said today skepticism is very active, sort of doesn't bode well for the future. Could you describe the connection between skeptical views and, like, what are the consequences of such skeptical views, or a summary of where they lead?
Well, the basic connection is that the one I mentioned is if the prevalence of skepticism puts reason out of commission as a source of moral, political guidance, puts it out of commission as a source of any philosophical outlook, so people look to other sources. Today, skepticism is I would say is widespread in a certain sense, usually more often implicit than explicit. But the fact is, these arguments are quite common, and it is commonly said that there's no basis for certainty. And in fact, what we observe is people turning to other types of philosophy. This new rise of religion, including fundamentalist types of religion, tremendous interest in Eastern religions, especially true during the 70s, but I mean, this is all part of a cultural phenomenon. Now, so I would say that to the extent that skepticism is prevalent, it's not a good sign, since I believe that a healthy culture and society is one that is confident in reason. I think that's the full answer to that. Okay. Yes?
From our different senses that we have, as you said that we can perceive reality there, or we can say that it exists. Are you also saying that the reality that I perceive is the same as the reality that you perceive?
Okay. There were a lot of elements in your question. Let me try to deal with them one at a time. And the main question is, how can I be sure that we're all perceiving the same, living in the same world, given that we, in various respects, perceive it differently? Well, one element in what you said was some people do not have all the senses that others have. Or, for example, Helen Keller was blind and deaf. Or some people's range of sensory experience is wider than ours. Some people, well, take species. Dogs hear higher sounds at higher frequencies than we do. Well, no one would claim, I certainly would not claim, that we have direct perceptual contact with every aspect of reality. No, we have perceptual contact only with a tiny slice of it, with a certain band of electromagnetic radiation, certain band of auditory frequencies, objects of a certain size, no bigger, no smaller, and so forth. The rest we have to learn by extracting information from what we can perceive and extrapolating through forming concepts and scientific inquiry, so that we discover that the range of colors we see, the visible spectrum, is part of, fits on a dimension that extends in both directions. And same with the other senses. Someone who say, perceived in the X-ray range, and not the visual color range, would see the world quite differently from us. That is, would see a different aspect of it. But once that person discovered that his narrow slice was part of a longer, wider continuum, he would identify that there are frequencies, the frequencies that give rise to visible, that we call visible light, that have certain properties. And even if he took it far enough, he could realize that that was stimulating certain types of sense organs, the ones we have. And so ultimately, though we would start in different places, we would arrive at the same view of the world. Now, there's also, in the nearsighted, farsighted case, and the case of people who have, or color blindness or whatever, species that perceive apparently quite differently from us. All these cases, I have to make an additional point, which is the way in which we perceive the world does depend on our own sense organs. My claim is just that it is a world that we perceive. And we can't untangle from, just by examining from the inside what our experience is like, we can't untangle which properties are intrinsic in the object and which are partly the result of the way our senses respond to them. We have to discover that by inquiry. And we have discovered some things. I'm sure there's more to be discovered. The common world we live in is the one that of objects with their intrinsic properties. And to the extent that we have all are of the same species and have sense organs of the same type, we do tend, mostly 90%, say, to perceive the world the same way. Not only the same world, but in the same way. We all see colors and hear tones and so forth, although there are small variations. So I'm not claiming that our we all perceive the world identically, just that we perceive the same world out there. And when you get to the case of the poets and the physics, these are forms of knowledge at such high levels of abstraction that are the result of so many lifelong choices of what is important and what to focus on, that it's perfectly possible for people to see the world in that sense quite differently. But it's the same world that they're seeing. They're just seeing different aspects of it.
Can be right in that the world that we see in essence is an illusion. In the fact that we are not perceiving it all. We can't really know the world that we live in without having total awareness, which is, I believe what Descartes was saying, that the only way to have total awareness is to be God. So the only way that we could know reality is to have total awareness, total knowledge, and therefore be God.
No, I would reject that. The way you cannot make as a condition of knowledge something that is impossible. And omniscience is not possible. So any standard that says to know reality we have to know everything, and we can't know everything, therefore we don't know reality, is relying on a false premise, that to know reality we have to know everything. There's no basis for that, precisely because we can't. That's not how the mind works. We're not omniscient. An omniscient knower would have to be something that knew by magic. Because any specific process of knowledge would have to be finite and operate to provide specific finite knowledge.
Stop. We can say that there is a reality, we just don't know how it's seen. We will continually grow. You have the caveman who discovered fire and wheels and that, and then you have us who discovered nuclear physics, and that our future generations will discover something else that we don't know. Where does that sense of knowledge start?
Well,
they perceive a new aspect of reality.
The progress of knowledge won't stop until we run out of things to know. And I don't see any reason to think that we ever will. Not because the universe is infinite, but just because there's no limit to the kinds of integrations we can make among all the facts there are. But the fact that there are things yet to be discovered doesn't mean, but in fact presupposes, that it doesn't mean that we haven't discovered anything yet. The fact that science will make advances on what we now know doesn't mean that we don't know what we now know.
What you're seeing is basically an illusion.
But there's a difference between a part of something and an illusion. What we see is true, even if it's not the whole story. Okay? let me stop here because we're starting to go around in circles a little bit, and I do want to see if there are any other questions. Yes?
Who was the philosopher responsible for bringing down the doctrine that objectivity equals intersubjectivity?
Gee, I don't know who the first person to put it that way is. It would have been during the 19th century sometime, in a sense you can attribute that to Kant by implication, because Kant used as a criterion, one of the criterions for what forms were structuring the mind, what was common to the way different people perceived the world. So that he said in one place in the Prolegomena, if you're familiar with that, he says there's a passage to the effect that the mark of objectivity is common universal agreement. That a judgment is objective if it's not idiosyncratic but would be agreed to by everyone. Therefore, common agreement is objectivity. That's not a verbatim quote, but it's something like that. So, I mean, that in effect is the idea of intersubjectivity as the definition of the objective. But I'm not sure which of the later philosophers who followed him actually made that formulation. Okay. Anyone else? Any new questioners? Yes. Yes.
Yes. With the case of a total skeptic who said you can't be sure of anything at all, wouldn't you just say, as a short one-liner to this person, that his argument is self-refuting because it commits the fallacy of self-exclusion, that he's omitting himself when he says that particular statement?
Yes, if someone says straight out, I know nothing, you have to ask, how do you know? Or do you know that? Well, perhaps we should pause here. I thank you.